As I said, we will close the loophole in the Safe Third Country Agreement. We will also hire 250 additional officers at the Canada Border Services Agency. This represents a 25% increase in our inland enforcement operation, which will strengthen law enforcement at the border. And we will deploy more judges of the Immigration and Refugee Board to the hotspots of illegal border crossers, so claims can be processed faster. We will also closely monitor those considered to be a threat for criminality, especially MS-13 gang members.
Conservative leader Andrew Scheer, as you heard there, made some promises today to crack down on the number of people crossing in between regular border or official border crossings in this country. The Conservatives have long called for making changes to the Safe Third Country Agreement. Welcome back to Power and Politics with the Power Panel, Tiffany Gooch, Ginny Roth, Andrew Thompson, and Jacques Poitras. Tiffany, I'll start with you. What do you think of the promises and the strategy potentially behind them?
So I would say that I expected this as an issue to be a lot more prominent over the course of the campaign in terms of how we saw it playing out as a conversation in the last year and a couple of years. And so I was sort of waiting for this part of the campaign to pick up. Not a surprise to me that it would be the week of Thanksgiving, where the most irresponsible conversations will be had about this among Thanksgiving tables with odd uncles, and sort of folks starting to think about this and talk about this openly. So I think that I hope that there's a lot of vigilance across communities and media and folks really talking about what's feasible, understanding what the agreements look like currently, and understanding also what it means to have integrity and trust in our border security systems. And I think that this is a place that can have a lot of disinformation. And I hope that while this conversation kicks off the way that it is this week, that we'll remain really conscious of, again, things that he's mentioned here about more border crossings across how they'll police them. I think there's a lot here to unpack, and I hope that we can do that, understanding the details of all of this better.
I think, Ginny, the main promise that I heard that jumped out at me there was the idea of closing the loophole in the Safe Third Country Agreement. And just for our viewers, that agreement is with the United States, and it essentially means that if you cross and you're seeking asylum, let's say from the United States into Canada, at an official border crossing, you're automatically turned back because Canada has made the agreement that the U.S. is a safe country to go back to. The loophole is that if you cross in between those points of entry, by foot is what's happened over the past 2 years, you are able to seek asylum in this country. The idea that you could just close the loophole, is there a feasibility issue there, Ginny?
Well, that was one of the components of what was annoued today.
We aired the other stuff here.
Yeah, that's to be negotiated, and of course there are enforcement components at different levels with the CBSA, and I think. I actually agree with everything Tiffany said. I think maybe we just disagree with what constitutes irresponsible conversations at the dinner table, because I think if you talk to immigrants in Canada or immigrants who are hoping to come to Canada, they would all say that we have a very fair system, and we have a system which accepts, I think everyone in every major party in Canada accepts, and most voters accept, that our economy and the success of our economy depend on bringing in as many immigrants in as orderly a way as possible, as quickly as possible, and upskilling them and settling them and creating the conditions for success. What's unfair and incompassionate is when you let people get around those rules and jump the line. And so, yeah, it's not surprising. Andrew Scheer's been talking about this ever since this issue flared up in the last couple of years. The Liberal government has not done anything to kind of seek remedy or close this loophole or solve this problem, which actually isn't consistent with the spirit of the agreement, of course. And so, look, there are all sorts of things that are negotiated between Canada and the U.S., trade among them. You can't, when you're running to be leader, foresee as Prime Minister what those negotiations will look like. You might not even know what president you'll be negotiating with, so it's tough
we do know Donald Trump's position on refugees, right? He is not the most welcoming. In fact, the NDP has gone so far as to say that Canada shouldn't consider it a safe third country. And just quickly on the point of queue jumping, I mean, the asylum system is different than the immigration system, right? Yep. What has happened is that the backlog at the IRB has grown. That's a fair comment for sure. But the accusation that they're somehow able to jump the line because they crossed on foot.
But it's not within the spirit of fairness, right? We all accept that if you are someone who makes it to a safe country, that you then don't have the right right to just enter another safe country and stay there. That's not something that is the spirit of the law. It's something that needs to be enforced, and it's something that needs to be renegotiated and agreed to between Canada and the U.S. And I think Canadians want to elect someone who's going to at least attempt to do that.
Andrew, how important do you think this issue is? I take both Ginny's points and Tiffany's points. I think that the discussion has definitely evolved since we were talking about this, I think, as a group, maybe even a year ago. And it hasn't factored into this election to a big degree yet.
It has, and I think in part because the Liberals started to correct some of the most egregious problems at the border. They, I think, recognized, although it was very much after the fact, that there were these problems with irregular crossings. I do think that they started to deal more with the backlog that had built up that they just weren't prepared for. So
put some money to it, yeah.
Yeah, the situation, I think, is better now, certainly, than it was a year or 18 months ago. There are, I think, two political issues that are still yet to be dealt with. One is this question about the Safe Third Country Agreement and whether or not that really is serving the purpose that it was intended to. I do think there is a merit to this conversation that we really shouldn't have that Canada is a country that should accept refugees on the basis of them claiming to be refugees throughout our own process, regardless of which country they're entering from. So that, I think, is a good policy conversation to have. Second piece that is a bit more political, I'm not surprised this is popping up now, not for the same reasons Tiffany's identified because of Thanksgiving and what we'll be talking about over Turkey on the weekend, but more thinking about this in the context of the debate that had just happened a couple of nights ago. Certainly there is a bit of rearguard action that I think the Conservatives are facing from Bernier, even though he is certainly not proving to be a political force. But within the Conservative base, there are people that wanting to still see this issue dealt with. And I think Ginny's articulated a lot of those the concerns that are there, whether they're warranted or not, whether it's borne out by the data. That's the debate. But that's my sense as to kind of why we're seeing it now, and I think why it's not been, probably not going to pop up again after this.
And it's interesting in the debate, Jacques, that when Mr. Bernier was going after Mr. Scheer on this, I remember Mr. Scheer making a point of saying, we are not like you, we don't believe in the same things, and he used immigration as a focus for trying to differentiate himself in the debate.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, of course, places like New Brunswick, there's a big focus on immigration in general as a policy objective because of labor shortages, declining population. What I think is interesting here is Scheer saying he can get a better deal out of Donald Trump on this issue. Trump's policies last year, which I think drove a lot of this increase that we saw on the border, were really designed to scare immigrants out of the U.S. from coming to the U.S. and out of the U.S. And I think that's what led to that big burst in 2018. It is less this year. Scheer was one of the few people to break from the Team Canada United Front on NAFTA and criticized Trudeau for how he handled the NAFTA negotiations. So it's interesting that he's positioning himself as the guy who can get a better deal out of Donald Trump on Trump's other signature issue, immigration. And I just can't see Trump heading into an election year with all the other problems he's having, agreeing to anything that would allow Canada to send people back to the United States. It's just hard to imagine.
It's interesting also because actually the Liberals, after the first year, I think, of this issue, Tiffany at first insisted, the agreement didn't need to change, and then eventually said, actually, we should be in talks with the government of the U.S. And my impression was that Minister Bill Blair, Mr. Bill Blair, who's now running as a candidate, but at the time, minister who was in charge of the border, entered into some kinds of discussions, and there was the possibility of formal talks. But the consensus seemed to be how are they going to get anywhere? Both the Liberals or whoever forms the next government in these discussions, because essentially you're almost asking Donald Trump to be responsible for more people seeking asylum, and that's been a huge issue with the other border, of course.
Yeah, so I think absolutely there have been many conversations that have been had over these last few years, and I think the Liberals have made attempts again to cover off financially the holes in the system to try to have the conversations they could have slowly, eventually. And so I think, again, very complex issue, a lot of pieces at play, very much unpredictable in terms of what a negotiation could look like with the U.S., but not necessarily fair to say that there's been no talk or no attempt at dealing with this at its core, which I'm certain there's been attempts.
I would agree that there has been movement on it, but I think the other piece, because we're in the middle of an election, this issue plays very differently in Quebec than I think it is in a lot of the rest of the country. Yes, it's an issue in the West, but it's more abstract.
They deal with it there, yeah.
Yeah, and so I guess what I think he's also setting up is for the Quebec debate, the ability to say he's going to take a tougher position on this. And I know that in Quebec, there were a lot of people very concerned as they saw the large number of refugees coming irregularly across the border. If you'll remember, they had to open up the Big O in order to house them at one point. This was a huge issue that I expect that Andrew Scheer will attempt to make into an issue about competence of the Liberal government as they move into the Quebec debate.
Do you think it'll work, Ginny? And I ask because I remember it being a big issue, especially a point of friction between the provincial government, led by François Legault, and the federal government. The federal government, under the Liberals, actually ended up giving them the money that they asked for to address the issue, which maybe also helped sort of quell the issue as a big point of debate.
After they referred to a provincial minister in Ontario as un-Canadian for suggesting that this might be a problem, that the province should have some funding to deal with it. I mean, the Liberals did their position on this has evolved quite a bit over the last year. This was something that initially they seized on as something that, in addition to, talking about abortion and gay marriage, they wanted to talk about the Conservatives being, racist or implying that they were racist, for wanting to have coherent, thoughtful, compassionate immigration policy. And I think ultimately their position has evolved to one where you really don't see that much pushback or squawking in relation to Andrew Scheer's announcement today, because it's the right one. It's where voters are at. It's what makes sense for immigration policy.
They've also allayed the concerns from. I mean, they ended up giving money to Toronto specifically, and to Ontario, and to Quebec as well to help the problem.
Yeah, after receiving a lot of pressure from the Conservatives to do so.
Jacques, final word to you.
It's a huge border, I mean, it's. I've been out on the border here with Maine. It's very remote, and boy, I think it's hard to enforce, and they talk about the balloon theory, right? When you squeeze it in one place, it just goes somewhere else. So I'm not sure what the solution is, but
get rid of the third party.
A lot of territory to cover.
The NDP would say, Andrew, yes. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.